Hello, everyone. I am Krista Cowan, and this is another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today, we are talking about marriage records, specifically about a brand new collection on Ancestry called the newspapers.com Marriage Index. Now, most of us know that marriage records are a really important record in family history research. It's what helps us connect generations. It's what helps us connect spouses to one another so that we know the maiden names of the women and when the family started. And sometimes it gives us information about parents of either spouse and where they were born. Sometimes there are ages included. And marriage records have been kept longer than any other vital record. So birth certificates are still not issued in some places in the world. And death certificates are a fairly new phenomenon in the history of the world. But marriage records have been kept for a long time. Now, here in the United States, marriage records have been kept at either a town level or a county level since the mid 16 and early 1700s. So a lot of local places started keeping them in that time period. They've been kept fairly consistently since the mid 1800s, again at a local level, and then they've been kept at a state level in almost all states since the early 1900s. So marriage records are a pretty consistent record that we can follow back through time. Now, there are a few challenges with marriage records that we have. One of them is that because they're kept at a local level and because they have not, for a lot of the periods of history that we're interested in for our family history research, been kept by aggregate archives with archival quality care, that means they were a lot more susceptible to damage over time. So the example that I often use in my own family history has to do with Arkansas. So many of you know that my family is from Northwest Arkansas on my mom's side. They migrated there from Tennessee in the early 1830s, and records were kept from the very beginning. They got there in 1831. The county was officially organized, Carroll County, Arkansas, in 1833. And they kept marriage records consistently as the one record that they were pretty good about. However, in 1863, there was a courthouse fire. And what that meant was that all the records from 1833 to 1863 were destroyed in that fire because they were held at the local county courthouse. So the only records that exist for my family start in 1863. And so we have to rely on other places and other information in order to either estimate or determine what the marriage dates were for those couples who were married prior to that 1863 date. So that's just an example. There are a lot of different examples of why marriage records may exist, may not exist. In some cases, those marriage records may be private. So different states have different laws regarding privacy. Some states consider marriage an open public record. Anybody can gain access to anyone's marriage record. And the rationale for that is that it's important to know if someone is married or not, if they want to marry again. I have a bigamist great-grandfather who ran into some trouble with that. But some states consider it a private record. And so they have a 50-year or 70-year privacy law attached to those records. So that's kind of the history of marriage records, at least here in the United States, and how we can or cannot gain access to them. So let me tell you, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the new record collection. So the brand new record collection on Ancestry is the newspapers.com Marriage Record Index. So newspapers, for the entirety of their history, I often refer to them as the Facebook of their day. Not only do they report what we traditionally consider as news items, but they very often also have sections on local community news. So things like births and marriages and deaths and divorces and arrests and awards and all sorts of little details about people's daily lives. And the newspapers on newspapers.com date back to the 1700s, and they go right up through the current time. So there's this huge collection of newspapers. As a matter of fact, they have more than 600 million pages of newspapers available on the site. And those details are in those newspapers. And sometimes those details can't be found anywhere else. So the challenge is getting access to those in such a way that they're searchable. Now, traditionally, newspapers, once a digital image is created, a computer reads that page in order to make it searchable. That's called OCR, or optical character recognition. Well, some of you may remember last year when Ancestry launched the newspapers.com obituary index. Ancestry has developed an algorithm that can read a page of newspapers and parse out articles, so figure out where the breaks are for different snippets of news on a page of newspaper. And it's more difficult than you might think the further back in time you go. So there weren't always clean borders around articles or lines that were drawn on the page. Sometimes the newsprint has become a little smeared. There's sometimes bleed through from the other pages. So there's lots of technical challenges to that. So Ancestry's developed an algorithm that allows us to read a page of newspaper and pick out articles. And then we've developed another algorithm that allows us to read that article and, based on the language used in the article, determine what kind of an article it is. So in this case, we have been able to identify marriage announcements, engagement announcements, and marriage lists. More than 200 million of them from 50 million of these little articles or snips that we've been able to determine on a page of newspaper. Now, what's a marriage list? Let's start there. When a couple goes to a courthouse to apply for a marriage license, they go into the court record that they've done that. And many newspapers across the United States over time have delivered a list of marriage licenses that have been applied for this week to the local newspaper on a weekly basis. And then the local newspaper would print that list of people who applied for a marriage license. So you'll end up with lists of people where it lists the names of the two people getting married. Sometimes it might also list their age, and sometimes it also might list their city of residence. Usually not much more than that. So we have the date of the newspaper, the publication place of the newspaper, and then the fact that these people applied for a marriage license. So that's exciting because it helps us to narrow in on when and where to look for a marriage license, what courthouse we need to contact, what other information we might be able to gain from the actual certificate were we to order it. The other thing about those marriage lists that's super handy is not always did people go through with the marriage. So sometimes you may find the name of an ancestor or a relative on a list of marriage license applications, and that's not a spouse that you're aware of. So just be aware that not always did they go through with the marriage, but if you contact the courthouse, they'll be able to show you or tell you if there's a marriage certificate that was returned attached to that marriage license application. So that's the first thing. We've got marriage lists in this collection. Now, even more exciting than that, and what you're going to see more often, are marriage announcements or engagement announcements. And sometimes you'll get both for the same couple. In my case, and for my parents, they had both an engagement announcement printed in the local paper in California by my grandmother, and then after they were married, also a marriage announcement describing the wedding. So both things are possible. Sometimes you'll get one or the other. Sometimes you get lucky and you get both. But 200 million of them from more than 50 million marriage announcements. Ancestry, again, we've looked at the 600 million pages of newspapers over on newspapers.com. We've been able to create an index from those records that tells us that a record exists over on newspapers.com with that information. So here's what I'd like to do for the remainder of our time together. I'm just going to walk through some tips and tricks for accessing these records and then for searching these records. So the first way is to search them from your tree. So your tree is online at Ancestry, presumably. And if you go to any person in your tree, what you're going to be able to do is search from that person, just like you search for anything else from that person. Okay. So let's see. I'm running a heavy internet load here, so it's taking a minute. Okay. So when you're on a person in your tree, this is a first cousin to my great grandfather. You can click search. Of course, what that does, just like always, it takes everything you know about this person, throws it at the search engine. Now, over here on the right or the left, if you scroll down, rather than going through all the search results, if you know you're looking for something specific, use the filters. So in this case, I'm going to filter to birth, marriage, and death. Then I'm going to filter further down to just marriages. And then I can filter down to a specific database. And in this case, the newspapers.com marriage index is right there at the top. You can see newspapers in this collection go from the 1800s to up all the way up through 1999. And the very top record there, Miss Fanny Allred marrying Herbert Adams in 1912. So I've got Fanny in my tree. I've got Herbert in my tree. I didn't know the details about their marriage date. So now I have this record that's going to show me that. So this is the index. They got married the 9th of January, 1912. It is Herbert Adams is her spouse. If I scroll down here, I can see the source information. So that's going to tell me that this marriage announcement ran in the Idaho Republican on the 19th of January, 1912 out of Blackfoot, Idaho. So I have some more details because of that. And then if I have a subscription to newspapers, I can also click through to view the actual image of the newspaper. So the newspaper index is available now on Ancestry, and now I can save it to my tree and search it through my tree. But to view the image itself, I have to do that over on newspapers.com. So here is the clip of their marriage. If I zoom out, you can see the full page of newspapers and how you've got little snippets of things that may or may not be marriage announcements or birth announcements or local news of some kind. And Ancestry's algorithm was able to determine that this little snip here is this marriage announcement. If we zoom in, you can see there's another marriage announcement just above that. Zoom in some more. Here's the kind of detail we're going to get in some of these. So Miss Fanny Allred and Herbert Adams were united in marriage by Justice I.H. Allred, which just happens to be her father, at the home of the bride's parents on Tuesday, January 9th. So now I know I can confirm that marriage date is correct, January 9th, 1912, at the home of the bride's parents. So it was published in the Blackfoot, Idaho newspaper, but now I need to go and verify whether or not her parents were actually living in Blackfoot or were they living in a neighboring community. Only a few members of the family were present, and the contracting parties have gone to housekeeping in a cottage in the Uni Edition at Blackfoot. The Republican, which is the newspaper, extends congratulations. So that's the marriage announcement of this particular cousin of my grandfather. And I found that by searching through my tree from her page in my tree. Okay. So that's the first way that you can access these records, is just start doing searches from your tree and then filter down based on the filters on the side down until you get to that specific collection. Now, the second way that you can search this is from the database directly. And you know what the words that are going to be that are coming out of my mouth next, which is go to the card catalog. So for those of you who are new with me, you may not have heard of the card catalog. So let me just make sure you understand what that is and where it is. If you click on search on Ancestry, the card catalog is going to be down here toward the bottom. And it is a listing of all of the databases on Ancestry. It's my favorite thing on the whole website and the fastest way to get to a specific database. So in this case, I just type the word newspapers into the card catalog, click search, and this new index, newspapers.com marriage index, very first thing that comes up. As you can see, the newspapers.com obituary index that we launched last year is the second thing that comes up. So you can search that directly as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and that takes me to a database page. And this database page then is where I can search just this set of records. So it's a really focused search. When you're searching a specific database, especially if it's a new database to you, I always encourage you to play around a little bit with it so that you understand how the search forms work, how information was indexed out of it, what some of the benefits and limitations are. I just find that it's a super useful exercise habit to get into. So I'm going to put in my last name, Cowan, and I'm going to click search just so that I can see what's returned in search results. Now, in this case, I'm going to see that 19,000 search results. That's immaterial at the moment. I'm going to see there's a name of a person and a spouse. There's a publication date and a publication place. So that's the information that's going to be returned. So even though I can fill in where they lived and when and where they were married and parents' names, all that information, I might not want to do that if the primary information on the record is publication date, publication place, and spouse name. So instead, what I might want to do is just come in here and put in the last name of a spouse. You'll notice in this case, I'm going to use a wildcard because I'm not quite sure how it's going to be spelled. And you'll see now I have a much smaller search result list. And all I did was dump in two things to search for, okay? Once I find the record that I'm interested in, then let's see here. Let's look at this one. Once I find the record that I'm interested in, I can then click through and view that record page. And there's a couple of things I want to point out on the record page as well. So here we have, let's see, we've got Miss Ivy Maeve Cowan, and she lives in a place called Castle Crock. It might be Castle Rock. And the marriage date is listed as the 21st of September, 1921. It lists a father named William Cowan, a mother with just the name Cowan, and then a spouse named Corwin Graves. Again, I can come down here to the source information and see that this information came out of the Salt Lake Tribune. It was published on the 18th of September, 1921. So if they got married on the 21st, this is a marriage announcement, not an article about the marriage after it took place, but an announcement that it is going to take place. And then the publication city information. Of course, I can click through and view the image, but here's what I want to point out, okay? When you do a search in this database, if you notice that when I hover over the names, let me make it bigger so everybody can see what I'm talking about. If you notice when I hover over the names, those are clickable links. So right now, the primary person that I'm looking at is Miss Ivy. But I could click through and view this same record rotated to her father. So I could have done a search for William Cowan, and this record still would have come up because he's the father of the bride. But what you'll notice is that when I've got William in the primary place, look at what's missing. What's missing here is a marriage date and place. So there's no event, date, or place, which tells me he's not the primary person on this record. This record is not really for him. He just happens to be mentioned in this record. So if you come to a place where you're seeing, you get a hint or a search result and there's no date or place, that's usually because it's a rotated record showing you that this person is mentioned in this record. And you want to click through to view the other people until it's rotated where you see an event date and place, okay? Now, there's a lot of different reasons we do that. We want to create a unique record for each person that's mentioned so that it can be attached to each of those people appropriately. And some people only attach the marriage record, for example, to the two people getting married. Some people also like to attach it to the four parents that are mentioned. Or in this case, we've the marriage record itself says that she's the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Cowan. So her mother is actually not mentioned by first name. So you might not want to save it to the mom. But this is a piece of evidence for the fact that she is the daughter of William Cowan. And so some people want to save it to everybody mentioned in the record, and everybody gets to make that choice for themselves. So when you go to save it to the person in your tree, in this case, I'm going to save it to Ivy. And then as I go through the save process, it's going to ask me, do you also want to save it to her spouse? Of course. Do you also want to save it to her father? Maybe, maybe not, but that's up to you. Okay. So pay really close attention to that as you are looking at these records. How is it rotated? Who's the primary person mentioned? And are they the person who is the primary person about that the event is about? Some of you have seen that with obituaries as well. So sometimes you'll get a hint on an obituary for like your mom, and you freak out because your mom's still alive. It's not that the obituary is for her, it's that she is mentioned in someone else's obituary. And so if you click on it, rotate it so that the date and place show up, you'll know who it's for. Okay. So that is how you do a search from the database directly. You go to the card catalog, search for newspapers, go directly to the newspapers.com marriage index, and do some limited field searching from there. I will give you one other tip about searching directly. What we've discovered is that marriage date isn't always listed. As a matter of fact, in my experience, it's listed less often than not, less often than it is. So I use the publication date and publication place fields when I do my searches in this database more often, because it's more often, for example, that we know a marriage license was issued, but that doesn't mean we know the marriage date, but we know that it was issued in October of 1943. So we can start to look for a marriage license within a week or two usually of that, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be a marriage date on this index because there's no marriage date listed in the newspaper. We just know where they obtained their license and when they obtained their license. So keep that in mind when you're doing those searches as well. Okay, next way to access this set of records, search from tree, search from database, or you can just wait for the hints to show up. So as always on Ancestry, we take these databases and we process them. Once we've published them, we then process them through 100 million trees on Ancestry, and we look through the 200 million records in this collection, and we see if we can generate hints for people mentioned in the collection that we think are the same as the people mentioned in your trees. And if we have a hint for you, it will come up. Lots of different ways. You'll have it on your all hints list. You'll have it on the hints tab here when you're on the person page in your tree, or we have these new record hints here right in your facts timeline that you can click through if we've got a hint for that specific event type, which in this case is marriage records. So we are currently processing those hints. I'm recording this video a few days before this record collection actually launches. It launches on October 19th, and then that's a Monday. And then the hint process will start generating hints after that. So it'll take a few weeks, but within a few weeks, you'll start to see some hints generated. So you are welcome to just wait for those hints to come through or actually go search them yourself. I'm not patient enough to wait for hints. So then the final thing that I want to tell you about this set of records is to watch for updates. So for example, when we launched the newspapers.com obituary index last year in September, we launched it with about 750 million records, 750 million people mentioned in obituaries. Then in March of this year, we added another 50 million records. And then just a couple weeks ago, we added another 30 million records. So that collection just keeps growing as new records get added. And there are a couple of ways that new records get added. First, newspapers.com is constantly acquiring and scanning new newspapers. So those new newspapers are usually newspapers that are being currently published, right? Or historical newspapers. So as those historical newspapers come in or are acquired by them, they scan them, and then once they've scanned them, Ancestry runs our algorithms on them to extract these records. And then every few months, we update these databases with new records. So historical records that are being acquired or new newspapers that are being published. Okay, so those are your search tips and tricks. Now, I know I'm going to get some questions about how to access the images themselves. So let's first talk about how to access the index. That index is available to anyone with a US or World or All Access Ancestry subscription. So you can access the index, the searchable index on Ancestry, if you have a subscription to Ancestry. Currently, this is just a US database, but we are working on databases of records from newspapers from other countries as well. And so you'll see those roll out over the course of the next year. This is just phase one, these 200 million records. So there will be some updates to this database in the coming months. And then, like I said, new records, new newspapers come online. So any subscription to Ancestry, US, World, or All Access will currently gain you access to this index of records. If you want to view the image, the actual newspaper image that is hosted on newspapers.com, you do need to have a newspapers.com subscription. So there are two subscriptions on newspapers.com. You can see them there on your screen. The first one is the newspaper's basic subscription. So that is 185 million pages of newspapers from more than 18,800 different newspaper titles dating back to the 1700s. It does continue to be updated. And then the other one is the Publisher's Extra. So that's, you get everything in basic plus an additional 431 million pages of newspapers. The difference is these newspapers are licensed from the publishers. So Ancestry, newspapers.com does not own the rights to the newspapers. They are typically still under copyright is generally the kind of the rule there. So they require an additional license because the publishers still own those newspapers. And so you can gain access to that. Now, the question I always get asked is, well, how do I know what's in basic and what's in extra? So let me just run through that really quickly. When you're on newspapers.com, across the masthead there, you'll see a browse button. The browse on newspapers functions a lot like the browse on Fold 3, serves the same purpose as like the card catalog on Ancestry. So the browse is by location, then by newspaper title, and then by date. So in this case, if I come over here, I go to Arkansas, I click on Bentonville. It's one of the places my family lived. It shows me here the 3 newspaper titles for Bentonville. I can click on that. It'll show me what years are available, and I can keep clicking through. All of these titles here are available in, I can just keep clicking through to different locations in Arkansas. All of these titles here are all available in the basic subscription. And the reason why I know that is because there's no symbol denoting that they're in the publisher's extra subscription. So let's look at an example. So if I come over here to California, I go to Los Angeles, where a lot of my family is from on my dad's side. Here's a list of papers in Los Angeles. You'll notice a couple of them have this little orange plus sign. And what that means is that some of the papers in that collection, or all of them, are under the publisher's extra subscription. So if I click on the Los Angeles Times, what you're going to notice here is starting in 1881 is when we have newspaper titles. And if I scroll, all of a sudden you're going to see it turns orange. And it turns orange in 1923. Here in the United States, typically that's when copyright is enforceable. Prior to 1923, these things are not in copyright. After 1923, these things are in copyright. So the newspapers prior to 1923 for the Los Angeles Times, part of Newspapers Basic, because they're in this blue color. After 1923, they're in this orange color because they are part of the publisher's extra subscription. So anybody can go on newspapers.com, click the little browse button, look for the newspapers in the places where your family may have lived, see what's available, and then see whether it's part of the basic subscription or part of the newspapers plus subscription. Okay. Now you need to decide for yourself whether it's worth it to get the Newspapers Plus subscription or not. If you have Ancestry All Access, so that gives you the Ancestry All Access subscription gives you access to everything on Ancestry. It also then gives you access to Fold 3, and it gives you a Newspapers Basic subscription. So if you want the Publishers Extra, you can upgrade to that on Newspapers, or if you can just do like a Ancestry US only subscription and then subscribe separately to Publishers Extra over on Newspapers. Lots of different combinations. We wanted to give people as much control over what they had access to and what they wanted to pay for as possible. So that's how that breaks out. If you have any extra, correct, seriously, all the jokes. If you have any extra questions about newspapers.com subscriptions or ancestry.com subscriptions, you're welcome to leave them in the comments, and I am happy to answer those. But I just wanted to make sure that you had kind of a basic understanding of those. Now, go forth, dive into this index, start looking at some of these articles. Some of them are just so amazing. There are stories about, what the bride wore and what the groom wore and what the flower girl wore and where they both went to college and what their jobs are. And it lists the relationships of the people in the wedding party. The bride's brother was the best man, and the bride's sister was the matron of honor, and the groom's sisters were the bridesmaids, and her cousin was the flower girl. I mean, it goes into all this detail about family relationships, and sometimes it'll tell you where they're going on their honeymoon and where they plan on living after the wedding. And so really, really rich detail in some cases. And then, like I said, in other cases, it's just a list of who applied for marriage licenses at the local courthouse this week. So lots of variability in there, but lots of things to explore. Hopefully you find it useful. Until next time, I'm Krista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.